the declining output thanks to lowering grades is really an early sign of terminal decline, because if it's operational, if it's weather, that's a sort of short-term event. But if it's declining grades, that's not something you can fix. You can only fix that through discovery. And that has, I've already sort of touched on that problem because we haven't been looking for these new deposits.
Yeah, so it's a perfect storm of existing supply sort of dropping off and a lack of investment. Hello and welcome to the latest video in our series on net zero. If you want to know just how bad the metallic dissonance of net zero politicians is, you're going to have to ask a mining veteran. And so I did. James Cooper is a global mining exploration veteran with some additional experience in corporate finance. In 2023, he combined these skills and became the editor of two investment newsletters in Australia, Diggers and Drillers and Mining Phase 1. With his knowledge of geology, mining and finance, he helps his readers profit from the upcoming mining boom in which net zero plays quite a role. James and I first met while giving investment presentations in Melbourne, Australia. It was our job to give our number one investment thesis to the rest of the publishing company that we both work for. And we gave an extraordinarily similar presentation about net zero, focusing on much the same arguments. Unfortunately for me, James got to go first that day, stealing my thunder. But I've got to admit, James's presentation featured a moment that made me very jealous indeed, as you'll see when we get going. He also dug into the solution to the challenge of net zero in more depth than me. But let's just say we kick off with a kick in the guts of the energy transition. A few weeks ago, a new colleague of mine gave a presentation about net zero to our editorial team. I've never seen a chart have quite such an impact on an audience before. There was literally an audible gasp and some nervous laughter. I'm joined, of course, now by that new colleague of mine, James Cooper, and we're going to be discussing net zero. But James, rather than breaking this to people gently, I want you to take us through that chart. It's actually two charts. It's the second one that drew that audible gasp. Take us through, it speaks for itself almost, but take us through what these two charts show.
Yeah, well, first up, thanks, Nick, for having me here. First up, we've got the global primary energy consumption chart. So this just shows all the energy consumption across all our different options that we have available. So we've got renewables at the top there, so the green little sliver. We've got the nuclear, which is the yellow. Then we've got all the fossil fuel options, so gas, oil, coal. And that makes up 82% of our total sort of energy supply. And we've got biomass there at the very bottom. So if we take all those traditional forms of energy out from that equation, we're left with that huge supply gap, so filling the void. So I've done a sort of rudimentary sort of editing and just cut out all the sort of fossil fuels. And it really does demonstrate the sort of insurmountable challenge that we have in sort of replacing all these fossil fuels. And that we just have a tiny sort of portion of renewables at the top there. So it's a gigantic task. And I think you're right. This graph sort of really emphasizes that problem that we have.
Yeah, it puts everything into perspective, and it's ironic how much we hear about the little sliver up the top and biomass almost as much down the bottom there. It's worth mentioning on this chart, there's carbon capture and storage there. So fossil fuels, but the carbon that they emit is captured and stored. And so the big question becomes, how much can we capture carbon efficiently, effectively, cheap enough, and so on and so forth. And to that extent, we might be able to have some fossil fuels. But of course, carbon capture and storage is very energy intensive, which means the whole energy challenge gets even worse. Right, with that extraordinary chart out the way, James, let's quickly mention who you are, what you do, why you gave such a similar presentation to me at our editorial meeting. If this is a case of great minds think alike, then we must be smart.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. So I just started with Fat Tail, the investment advisory platform in Australia. So I launched Diggers and Drillers. So we have a mining focused publication. So that's just using my previous experience as a geologist, predominantly exploration. So we're really sort of tapping into the opportunities, which does go into the critical metals space, so net zero challenge. Also looking at other opportunities, so different energy forms of energy which may not be sort of so mainstream, and just more traditional commodities as well. So like gold, iron ore, these sorts of things. So really just looking at the full spectrum of opportunities, and just using that industry knowledge to sort of pick these stocks, but also looking at the macro picture as well.
Yeah, and that's why I've invited you on. Our roles are very similar. We try and turn these big ideas into actual specific practical financial advice, which will not feature in this video. But the idea is that we can explore where you're looking for stocks, what sort of exposure you're looking for given the net zero story. And you come up with many of the same conclusions that I do. But first of all, let's go through the net zero challenge. You started your presentation with the missing piece, as I think of it, which is just how bad the fossil fuel situation is because of the vast amount of underinvestment. Now, a few days ago, Nigel Farage interviewed someone from the Green Lobby, shall I say, and this person from the Green Lobby was saying this energy crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. It's just another example of why we shouldn't rely on renewable energy. And of course, the question is, well, why is there a fossil fuel crisis? And your presentation explained the connection to net zero.
That's right. So it really does start with fossil fuels. So I remember back in the presentation I did with you guys a few weeks ago, I mentioned how oil and gas discoveries in 2021 hit their lowest levels in 75 years. And that was according to one of the big sort of energy analyst firms, Rystad Energy. So why does that really matter? Well, 75 years ago, so we go back to 1946, and energy consumption back then was just 100 exajoules. But bring step forward to 2021, and annual energy consumption is almost 600 exajoules. So same rate of discovery from 75 years ago, but 6 times the demand. So it's that's sort of the challenge that really awaits. And this problem really started back in 2015. So this was at the bottom of the commodity downturn. So the very sort of the most metals, oil and gas really sort of hit their low point in 2015, 2016. But the problem for oil and gas investment at that time hit multi-decade lows, and Rystad Energy rightly pointed that out to the global economy, that they were one of the few really sort of pinpointing this looming problem. But that problem hasn't been fixed, so it's really fallen on deaf ears. So over the last sort of 6 years, this multi-decade low in new discovery and new investment in oil and gas has really just hit new all-time lows. So rather than sort of rectify that problem, it's just becoming worse. And I think this is also highly inflationary because we've potentially got shortages of energy, which is being led by a lack of new oil and gas discovery. So really presents us with a problem. And I think governments are assuming that the sort of renewables will sort of pick up the slack from declining oil and gas discovery. But this is a much more immediate problem than I think most people give weight to, because to bring an oil and gas discovery into production can sort of take up to 10 years. So it's looming as an immediate problem because this all started back in 2015. So we can really use some simple maths and say, okay, maybe mid-20s, that's when the shortages of fossil fuels really starts to hit. But then we get to the problem, can we actually generate enough replacement technology, so wind farms and solar panels, when this oil and gas sort of cliff starts to sort of hit the global energy market? And that's where we could start to talk about whether we could get to that point.
And so to sum that up, it seems like we've transitioned away from fossil fuels before having this alternative up and ready, to the extent that it's even possible to have it up and ready. So you're expecting there to be a sort of quite a long, consistent period of energy crises, and the last year, 2 years in Europe is going to be the norm, not the exception.
Yeah, that's right. I think, I mean, a lot of people have spoken about Europe as it really had the get out of free jail card. It was looking problematic, but then we had one of the warmest, or Europeans had one of the warmest winters on record. Also did a great job of looking for alternative supplies. I know Australia supplied gas to Europe. So it really averted the crisis and probably masked some of the looming shortages. So one of the largest, or the largest oil and gas producer, Aramco, stated that the world is currently running on around 2% excess capacity. So it really doesn't take much much of a spike in demand to really kind of change the dynamics of how we sort of manage our energy needs.
One of the big takeaways here is that if people expect the net zero attempt to fail, and if they believe that we'll just transition back to fossil fuels and that will fix the problem, they're in for a really rude shock and an expensive shock.
That's right. And I think if we sort of look at the critical metals, so um, I know you had a professor, so associate professor Simon Michaud, on one of your podcasts recently, and he's one of the few people that has really kind of dug into the data and really tried to determine, do we have enough metal sitting in the ground to sort of reach this net zero goals. So he's one of these people that have looked at the total metal reserve sitting in the ground versus what we need to replace one generation, or what we need to entirely replace fossil fuels with one generation of wind farms and solar panels, and it really comes up with some pretty startling figures. And I think this sort of peer-reviewed study was really sort of sending shockwaves through the EU, and through sort of political leaders have just assumed that these critical metals, the renewables, would just naturally pick up the slack from lack of new oil and gas supply coming through. So just to, I guess, highlight some of the dramatic data that he found, which has been critically reviewed among academics. So the data does stack up. It's strong. So based on current annual production, so current mining production, he came up with around 9,900 years worth of lithium, and 1,700 years worth of cobalt, 3,200 years worth of graphite. So it's just these figures that really sort of put a dent in how we can actually achieve this net zero.
Yeah, and there's been a few similar studies by people other than Simon that have found similar. Obviously, it depends on how you play around with the assumptions. But one of the key issues that you especially know about is that, much like in the fossil fuel energy world, investing in mining and the status of the mining industry isn't particularly healthy either. This is only partly due to the net zero story, although it is becoming more difficult to permit and develop a mine. But take us through what the state of the mining industry is and whether it's going to be capable of delivering, in your view, the amount of metals and other resources needed to try and fill that void as we started off with in the transition.
Yeah, so the problem with mining is we've really gone through the same issues that the oil and gas industry has faced. So that's just a lack of investment in the industry. So around 2015, 2016, we saw a major low in the industry. So it's this same problem of lack of investment, which is really going to translate into lack of supply over the next 5, 6 years, or probably earlier. So it is picking up, especially in Australia. There's more funding going back into exploration, but we've had this enormous gap in new discovery, which is really going to translate into problematic supply in global chains over the next few years. And I'm not sure if you can see this graph, Nick. So it just shows you copper discovery over the last 10 years, and you can see it really is at record lows. If we go back to the 90s, copper discovery, we were making sort of 10 to 15 new major discoveries every single year. Over the last 10 years, we've really only made two major discoveries. So
Why
the
is that? What's changed?
yeah, so really down to two factors. The first one is what I was saying. So lack of capital coming into the industry, lack of spending on exploration. So that's from investors. It's also from the big miners themselves, not really taking the high risk bet on exploration to bring new discovery. The other one is it is becoming harder to find new deposits. So it's new deposits are deeper. All the easy sort of near surface copper deposits or nickel deposits have already been found. So it's these two problems which are really kind of combining into the perfect storm. So one of the last major copper discoveries was Ivanhoe's deposit in the Congo of the DRC. So other than that, we're really sort of scrambling to sort of find where can we make these new discoveries, and that's really being made worse by the fact that in some of the major copper producing nations like Chile, we're seeing sort of increased risk of nationalization. In Peru, there's riots, there's talk of civil war. So these two places make up around 25% of total copper output. So that just puts an enormous pressure on future supply. And then we've got the third biggest copper producing nation in the Congo, which has also got similar sort of geopolitical risks. So there's a lot of factors which really not just threaten the outlook for reaching net zero, but perhaps even threatening the outlook of just maintaining our current sort of needs for copper, let alone the exponential demand that's been forecast.
One of the little light bulb moments that I had during your presentation was that just as it takes 10 to 15 years to get a mine up and running, the existing set of mines, regardless of the investment environment, they persist in their production for a long time until suddenly they shut off, which means this problem is masked by those existing mines and their high levels of production until all of a sudden it's not. So what's the outlook for the big copper mines around the world basically running out of resources in the next few years?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can really start to see some clues. So in Chile, Chile just recently reported about a 6% decline in its output, and it attributed that to poor grades. So I've got a chart here again. So we've got global copper grades, which have steadily fallen off from about 1.4% down to a low of 0.6%. So that's an enormous drop in grade. So if you think about grade, if it's dropping off, that just makes it more expensive to mine. So for the same ton of ore that you pull out of the ground, you're going to be getting only sort of a third of the copper from that single ton of ore. So it produces more emissions. It costs more. So it costs more in fuel. It costs more in labor. So it just compounds the problem. But again, I think you can really look at these big porphyry copper deposits in Chile and Peru as an early sign to some of the threats to supply. So if we're seeing Codelco, which is the major sort of copper conglomerate in Chile, which is reporting sort of year on year declines in its output. Well, that's an early warning sign. Declining output thanks to lowering grades is really an early sign of terminal decline, because if it's operational, if it's weather, that's a sort of short-term event. But if it's declining grades, that's not something you can fix. You can only fix that through discovery, and that has I've already sort of touched on that problem because we haven't been looking for these new deposits.
Yeah, so it's a perfect storm of existing supply sort of dropping off and a lack of investment. And both of those are delayed effects, and that delay is hitting now. Something you mentioned earlier about Simon Michaud's research, it only takes into account the first generation of renewables, meaning that by the time 2050 hits, we're going to have to do it all again, which, doubles, depending on the recycling rates, doubles the demand for all these resources all over again. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from you, which I didn't think of before listening to your presentation at all, is the idea that it takes 10 to 15 years to get a mine up and running, but it takes 5 to 10 years to get an oil or a gas well up and running. And we've already got the infrastructure to use oil and gas, whereas we haven't got, we have to build the windmills, we have to build the solar plants, and so on and so forth, which means in a situation where we don't have sufficient energy to run our economies and our societies, which is what you and I expect because of this lack of investment, if we get a desperate scramble for more energy, all of the focus is going to be going towards gas and oil, right? Because it's going to be the fastest plausible solution. People won't want to wait 10 to 15 years to get the mine up and running, and then a few more years to get the manufacturing of the renewable resources, and so on and so forth. So the sort of snapback of the rubber band is going to go towards fossil fuels far more so than renewables as these energy shortages hit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is the natural sort of path. I think political leaders will sort of, and the public will start to realize, okay, we're probably not going to achieve this net zero target based on making windmills and solar panels. For a start, it probably is not enough to create baseload power, but we really have the underlying problem of critical metal supply. So you're right. I think we have some other options for baseload power. There's talk of geothermal, fission. So all these technologies which could perhaps one day supply the global energy needs, but it's still very in the lab research R&D type level. So it's not an immediate problem, an immediate fix to the looming problem. So you're right. I think oil and gas will be the solution until we can come up with a sort of a viable baseload power source which doesn't emit carbon dioxide.
And we saw this play out in Germany, especially where when they had this issue with the Russian gas, they didn't build lots of windmills and solar power plants. They built LNG import terminals because they understood that that is the fastest way to bring in energy quickly. So if you're expecting an energy shortfall over the next few years, that's where economies will turn to. Let's turn to the solution here, which was really the theme of your presentation, and that's nuclear power, something I agree with. So give us your take on why nuclear is the ultimate solution and possibly the best investment opportunity here.
Yeah, so I think as investors start to really realize the insurmountable challenge of reaching net zero, I think nuclear really stands out as one of the most viable solution, really. In that earlier graph that I showed you, nuclear still only makes up a tiny slither of overall energy needs. There's still a lot of fear, still a reluctance in sort of bringing on nuclear energy. But I think if we are serious about reaching net zero, I think nuclear is really the only option that can provide base load power to fuel economies. There's also the potential for nuclear to produce or to help with the hydrogen manufacture, which is also really energy inefficient because it takes a lot of energy to separate into hydrogen. So nuclear as a cheap form of energy, once you've got the infrastructure in place, allows you to make hydrogen. So that sort of takes away from the need to rely on EVs, which are metal intensive. So that takes away that problem as well. The problem, though, with nuclear is it does take a long time to build these giant facilities. So up to sort of 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years, these giant nuclear facilities. So it doesn't solve the immediate problem. And I think we still need the oil and gas to come back into the energy mix through new investment in exploration and development of new oil and gas fields. So I think nuclear stands up as a sort of more longer term solution, unless we can come up with, say, geothermal, which essentially is like natural nuclear energy anyway. It's using hot rocks in the ground. It's nuclear is a proven technology, so we know how it works. It's been in we've had nuclear plants, phase three plants in operation for decades. So it is a viable solution. So as an investment theme, obviously you have to sort of look at the commodity. So that's uranium. So you could look at uranium stocks. You could focus on existing producers. There's a few. There's not a lot of existing producers because uranium has been through this long bear market since the Fukushima disaster. Uranium prices really fell away. We've only just seen a recovery start to happen in uranium prices since about 2020. And that just means there's not a lot of explorers to choose from at the moment. So you really have to just look at some of the big major producers. There's some in North America. There's a few options in Australia. And there's a few developers looking to sort of bring back their uranium mines that have been sitting on care and maintenance for the last sort of 10 years while your uranium prices have been depressed. So it perhaps doesn't offer the same diversity of opportunities like you would see in the sort of net zero EV battery metal landscape because it is purely just uranium. Unless maybe you looked at some of the sort of technologies that will feed into building some of these nuclear power plants as well.
Yeah, a lot of the government control in this sector is quite stifling.